All right, thank you very much. So the title of our inception paper is Political Distortion and Structural Transformation by Monica and myself. And so let me see. Okay, so as a way of motivation, which is very much the motivation of the whole STEG project, is that there are large differences in productivity across sectors and firms, within countries and also between countries. And you know, the literature has focused on technology, human capital, and more recently on misallocation. You know, so and in those models, the government were somewhere in the background. You know, as a social planner or something along those lines. And, you know, more recently, there are increased interests in political distortions and institutions. So why? Well, because, you know, connected firms, for instance, may have the opportunity to gain undue political or economic power to generating severe economic inefficiencies. And this, you know, detecting those dysfunctions and distortion and correcting them, you know, with proper institutional reform and economic reform is quite important for development. So the structure of the presentation will be, you know, we are going to start with a benchmark, you know, like acknowledging and covering the normative theory of government intervention and the role of institutions. So, and then from there, we are going to look at the departure from those normative theories. And then, you know, the states, elite capture, and political distortion in general, and look at the effect on technological innovation and industrial policies. So, and then we are also going to try to uncover the mechanism of this effect with special focus on market power, rent seeking, and patronage, you know. So, and there will be a very, very special focus, which is, you know, after all, it's a macro project where we try to provide some micro foundation, but you know, there is a special focus on structural political distortions, you know, like crony capitalism, elite capture, and those are deep, like rooted forms of structural political distortion, and look at the implication for reforms and direction for future research, you know. So as Doug has said, and I mentioned at the beginning, this is the beginning of a paper, you know. So we probably have missed a lot of very important papers, maybe focus a lot on more recent papers. But, you know, we'll make sure that we correct this when we are writing up the inception paper, that for sure, you know. So for instance, in the outline that we sent you, we sent to at least Ernesto, Daron, and Rohini. We have papers that were included that are not here in the slide. Okay, so as I said earlier, so there is a large literature on why and how to industrialize. Basically, what is the rationale for structural transformation, and what are the role of government intervention, you know? So you have a seminal paper by Barreau in which government is like more or less a social planner, and to see, for instance, how government spending can actually affect growth and development. Murphy, Schleifer, and Vishny seminal work on big push industrialization, for instance, talk about different policies that could push for industrialization, simultaneously investing in different sectors, you know, the coordinating role that government can play, you know, in achieving, you know, structural transformation. And, you know, Harrison and Rodriguez and many others have done a great job in summarizing this literature and talking about soft and hard intervention by government. So there are more recent kind of political economy literature that points to policy failures, institutional failures, and providing theories of such failures, literature led by Asimov and Robinson, particularly the 2006 paper in American Political Science Review, and Alesina and al, talking about late Alesina and all talking about, providing political economy model of basically like more micro theoretical kind of model of development that's very useful. So while this research is incredibly important and highlights macroeconomic explanation for those discrepancies at the international level in growth, I think there is increasing needs and space to focus on microeconomic causal mechanism. So that's why the framework that we find particularly interesting in this context, which is a good complement of the one that I just basically that I described, is the Schumpeterian model of growth. Well, because what is interesting in that model, in those models, is competition, is heterogeneity. So it shows how development and social transformation requires, economic competition and competitive markets, and is also focused also on political competition. It highlights the relationship between democracy, innovation, and development. And this is well summarized by Aguillon and al. Nobel address that they turn into a paper. So the explanation behind this is that innovation. I mean, the premise of all this is the idea that innovation-led growth is correlated with turnover of firms and jobs, and also political competition or government turnover. So when there is pressure, creative destruction, in the economic side, that's on the economic side. On the political side, these pressures on incumbent, it's something which is essential for growth. So why, particularly, well, because political competition reduces the threat of expropriation of successful innovators by politically connected firms, but also competition might also couple with regulation, might help protect, maintain competition and controlling market power of dominant firms. So it's critical that competition be coupled by regulation along the line of the work of Stigler, 71, Lafont and Tirole, in terms of regulation. So, okay. Now, I should add that there is a strong empirical support for this Schumpeterian framework to understand the role that political competition and economic competition will play. So there is some empirical evidence provided in Aguillon's article that show, for instance, you inverted relationship between innovation and competitive markets, and the fact that frontier industries and industry that are at the frontier of technology, they tend to be more growth. They contribute to growth more effectively in countries that are democratic. So there is some kind of macro level empirical support for this, and there are more recent papers, for instance, that look at this, this relationship. For instance, there is a recent paper that I'm going to cite shortly that show how connected firms tend to be less innovative. So in fact, there is a direct micro evidence, firm level evidence that connected firms tend to be less innovative. Okay, so this is first the broad kind of benchmark that's already out there. So more recently, there is really an explosion. There is really a huge increase in literature documenting the departures from from this kind of normative theories and framework. And we are going to focus on two. We have the departure one will be more in the line of firms and politicians kind of framework, political distortion generated by political connection. So that's what it is. So we focus on regulation and bureaucratic capture. And so I'm going to, I'm not going to go through all the papers that I mentioned earlier, but there are some that I want to mention, for instance, to show, how, to show the new development, for instance, how the evidence that they provide is it's quite important and relevant. So, for instance, Facio's paper showing more broadly that connection is more present in countries where level of corruption is high, where you have less transparency and less regulation, so which is very, very important. And now, particularly in lobbying, there is this paper of Boas, Hidalgo, and showing, for instance, how Brazilian public firm bought policy, basically they pay for policy change, and that benefit them a big deal, 14 times their contribution. This used data from campaign contribution and the return for the campaign contribution. So, Hunus and Kim paper is an example. We have, the old, not that old, but the earlier literature on protection for sale and many others in the trade literature, So lobbying is something which is highly, highly documented. So what is interesting here is that we are moving this literature out of, US and Europe and take them to developing countries where it's becoming increasingly relevant. So you also have state capture, which is regulation and bureaucratic and other forms. And a very interesting, paper that I just came across is the one, for instance, where where there is a focus on rent. This paper on Lithuania, showing evidence that procurement auction rigging by connected firms. Nathan and Al, that was just presented, also show, for instance, the different forms that it can take when you have more competition. Something which is important here is to understand that it just shows how competition is not enough, that institutions that prevent bureaucratic and regulation capture are critical, to improve welfare, So, but we should stress that competition is a precondition for those regulations to be effective. Now, one set of literature that is not it's also very important, which is far more developed in political science than in economics, is state capture by international and multinational firms. So whether it's on trades, whether it's on mining industry, have massive consequence for political stability. There are countries where the distortion, the capture took the form of coup d'etat, which is more or less initiated by multinational corporations in many countries. So, what I think maybe is a bit missing in this literature is perhaps more attention and focus on mechanism. I'm going to talk about that in a second, but also, the international dimension. There is a lot of important literature documenting what's happening between firm and political and local level. But for structural transformation, given the important role of foreign direct investment and multilateral corporations, we should also not just look at those corporations, what they do, what they bring in terms of investment, in terms of technological advancement, but in fact, how do they, what they do politically? How do they do to control either the states, but also the political process in these countries? So now, as I mentioned earlier, there are several kind of possible mechanisms that have been explored. And, and I think one of the big kind of step forward that we need to make is to document those mechanisms, like more empirically, more theoretically, in the line of what, for instance, Adnan and co-authors have done for the bureaucracy, not only to understand the effect of political connection, but documenting explicitly the mechanism, the different mechanisms at play, in explaining the effect on innovation, on technology, and industrial policies. So I'm going to basically mention three, which is already, which has significant coverage in the literature, is market power of connected firms. This is very present in US. I didn't mention Philippon's work on the tech companies in the US, but it's well covered. So, I think through analyzing prices and with other data, it will be interesting to see how connection leads to larger market power. If there is any kind of difference between what we observe in developing countries and what we observe in developing countries, because, maybe dominant firms are less entrenched in these countries, and they might be resisting political control more than developed countries. And this might lead to some kind of key differences in the market structure in these countries that we need to capture. We also will have the fact that in many developing countries, we have a very large informal sector, that's unregulated. And the culture of this informal sector in itself, it's something that's a big difference between developing countries and developed countries, is something that we can explore. So another one which is very well covered is rent seeking. The favorable deal, loans and procurements and auctions and so on that connected firms have, highly documented. Again, it might be interesting, for instance, to do that in more countries and to see the nuances that we might observe. The last one is patronage, which is basically management practices, and through revolving door, through cronyism in a form of labor markets, or hiring in public services, in public administration, and look at the effect that it has on innovation and industrial policies in general. So as I said earlier, when Anna was presenting, so the politicization of bureaucracies, for instance, is a big issue in developing countries, and it's important that not only we make relationship between politicians and firms more transparent, but we also have major reform in public administration to prevent patronage. So I'll stop there and then get Monica to talk about the next discussion 2 and the other topics that we plan to cover. Thank you.
Thank you, Leonard. Okay, so let me pick up where Leonard left. I'm going to talk about the second type of departures that we call more persistent or more structural. So The difference with respect to the ones that Leonard mentioned is that these type of distortions might be better characterizing how the system works as a whole rather than specific in bad instances. So in particular, I'm going to talk about crony capitalism and elite capture. So crony capitalism has been discussed in the literature as of systems or situations in which the private sector and the government collaborate and are highly entrenched with a number of quid pro quo type of exchanges of favors. So one classical example of this setting is the case of China. So Bei-Xie and Song in 2019 published a very interesting paper called Special Deals with Chinese Characteristics, which in a previous working paper version was called Crony Capitalism with Chinese Characteristics. And essentially what they discuss in this paper is that the Chinese system nowadays is characterized by an intense private sector activity, but in a sense, the private sector firms that thrive, almost a prerequisite for that economic activity is that they have to have local political connections, oftentimes at the local level. And local governments do not hide or feel ashamed of this type of situation. Oftentimes, some of these private firms have been founded by the same politicians, right? By party secretaries or county executives, etc. So they do a case study in which they visit a southern city in China for a few weeks to document how these special deals work and how they are made. And for instance, they highlight a number of interesting things. For instance, this particular city had 7 vice mayors. Some of them were supposed to be in charge of health, others of education, but they were doing none of that. What they were essentially almost exclusively doing was to each of them supporting a number of private firms in their development. So there are a number of open questions, right, related to crony capitalism. So the first one is how widespread is this phenomenon around the world? How much this characterizes the type of economic activities that happen in many developing countries? So after the seminal paper by Fazion, which she documented that a large fraction of firms in 47 countries had political connections. But she focused on publicly listed firms and she focused on national level politicians, right? But this might only be the tip of the iceberg, right? In the sense that many other firms are not listed. And as we saw from the case of China, many of these political deals do not happen at the national level, right? So it seems that with access to administrative data, we could improve upon this and try to provide better accounting of what is the situation and how much this characterizes the type of economic activities that we see throughout the world. More research is also needed in trying to figure out how and when these type of deals are detrimental for economic activity, right? So for instance, Xie and co-authors argue that in the case of China, it's not detrimental or doesn't seem to be detrimental to economic activity, although we don't know what's the counterfactual. But the argument is that both the strong state capacity of the Chinese state, together with local competition among governments, means that this system doesn't raise barriers of entry for new entrepreneurs. Essentially, the logic is that if I am an entrepreneur and I'm blocked from striking a deal with a particular local government, I can always go to the local government next door, and that will help me get the connections and I can do my activities. But still, whether this is the key theoretical explanation or not, this is still, we don't still have a good empirical evidence to figure out whether that's the case. And furthermore, one could, of course, ask the question of why does it work here? Why doesn't it work there? Is it about the type of political institutions, about some other type of cultural norm, social trait? Maybe it's about the level of civil society oversight over these activities, bureaucratic capacity, etc. I think that we know relatively little of this. And this set of questions might be even more important to further study in the future, right? So this is my last point, is capitalism, crony capitalism here to stay? In a recent literature review by Eigen and Roderick, they argue that the industrial policy of the 21st century is not going to be about extending favorable credit or export quotas to certain sectors of firms. Is much more about sustained collaboration between the private sector and public sector in public and private partnerships. And we do also see some of these in certain sectors. So for instance, we're going to see tomorrow a fascinating paper by Martin Beraja, David Young, and Noam Huchman, in which they argue that the connection of the state government with private sector firms was key to the development of the artificial intelligence sector in China, right? So if this is the future, further studying how this type of systems or this type of industrial policy turns into crony capitalism versus other structures with less political interference in the private sector deserves further study. Okay, so the second type of structural departure that we study is elite capture. So this literature has been fundamentally, or to a great extent, theoretical, and we argue that the empirical evidence, despite there has been a lot of work in the last decades, is still limited relative to how much is there left to understand. So most of this theoretical literature argues or defines elites as a group of individuals that have de facto power, which means that their ability to influence policies and decisions in an economy extends way above what their numbers would accrue to them, right? This power is oftentimes conceptualized as coming or emanating from access to a number of resources, right? So, or that minority having greater economic resources. So the early empirical literature focus or characterize these elites as large landowners. And of course, that was historically relevant for many parts of the world and in some instances today. However, our observation is that over time, the nature of elites has changed and it's more fluid and more diverse. And possibly the limits into obtain a workable definition that is empirically relevant in a large number of countries is limiting the ability of this literature to proceed, at least in terms of microempirical literature. So in some instances, some studies have conceptualized these elites as cultural based, maybe based on an ethnicity or caste. Other parts of the literature based on families or sets of political dynastics, access to patronage, links to previous non-democratic regimes, or links to the state. But we argue that these difficulties in pinning down what is an elite member is hindering the ability of this literature to move forward. So just let me put an example. So suppose or consider a mayor in a small city in Indonesia. Is that a member of an elite or not? So to the extent that this individual has power to decide things that is conferred to him or her due to the de jure institutions, and this person represents the wills of their constituency, that person might not be classified as a part of an elite. However, if this same person with the same position has access to patronage, has access to vote buying, and has a number of large corporations, that same individual could be actually better represented by this notion of elite that comes from the theoretical literature. So what we argue is that for this literature to further evolve, we need improvements on how do we define elites and how do we measure de facto power. And both things need to come together in the sense that the more diffuse nature of elites makes it less likely that we can pin them down essentially by an observable characteristic. Right? Possibly we need to get better measures of the de facto power of different agencies, individuals, and actors in order to classify them as an elite. Then, of course, we need to make much more progress on trying to understand what is the effect of elite capture on development, technology adoption. I think that this is areas where we could still see a lot of improvements into the empirical literature. And of course, as Doug and Joe mentioned, one of the objectives of this theme is to also be policy relevant, right? So another interesting set of questions is how do we make reforms that could potentially break this elite equilibrium into a more favorable type of institutions. So one possibility could be to block these elites from their access to their rents or from power somehow. However, this has been historically proven as a risky business in the sense that once reform have tried to block these elites from their preferential resources, that have led to a lot of political instability, oftentimes leading to the violent removal of the leader that was trying to push for these reforms. So other parts of the literature has highlighted that reforms to political institutions such as democratization might be a way of changing this type of political equilibrium. However, oftentimes how these processes work and the details of them become critical. So for instance, in some of my earlier work, I study how the democratization of Indonesia affects the persistence of local elites. And what we found in this paper is that just allowing Suharto mayors a few extra years in power during the transition greatly affected their ability to get entrenched in power and to limit and to damage the quality of democratic institutions. So in that sense, more microevidence is needed to figure out, even if we understand that democratization oftentimes helps, how to make that process even work better. Another strand of the literature has looked at within elite competition. So even within an elite equilibrium, the more elites you have contesting or competing one another, that seems to be leading to better outcomes. So that's potentially a reassuring or positive message that could lead to policy recommendations. However, it's still unclear whether that's a strategy that we would at any point recommend, because in a sense, things might work a little bit better on the margin, but you could entrench even farther the whole system and prevent further change to a better kind of completely different kind of equilibrium. So
Monica, you should be about on time right now.
Okay, so I'll be brief. Let me take a couple of minutes. Yeah, let me take a couple of minutes and I'll be brief. So another area where we want to also review or to promote further research is in trying to figure out how to quantify this level of political distortions here, and not only in elite capture, but also lobbying, crony capitalism, or the ones that Leonard had discussed. And most of the literature frames these distortions as having negative effects into the economy, but of course there are always people that are skeptical or find nuances to that argument. So for instance, Banerjee, Hannah Olken argue that lead capture is limited in the allocation of targeted programs in Indonesia, and actually designing programs to circumvent local elites might be damaging the amount of local information that the program leverages on.
Sorry, can I, Ernesto, I think because Joe and Doug talked for about 5-10 minutes at the beginning, we were 10 minutes.
Want to shift everything by...
Okay, yeah, exactly. Yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay.
Might not need 10 minutes, but let's, it's great to close some of these arguments. So, we find that some recent research, and very exciting, had tried to had quantitative assessment of how some of these distortions affect the economy. So for instance, Colony and Prem used the anti-corruption audits in Brazil and their staggered implementation, and find that after 3 years after a corruption audit had taken place, there is an additional level of new firms entering in that municipality of 1%. And they argue that this is essentially driven by the fact that the anti-corruption audit cracks down on corruption, that lowers the level of corruption, and that it's what it leads to more entry of new firms. They find that the new entrants have high quality in terms of managerial quality, so it seems that these are interesting firms to support into this economy. Burgess and et al. Have an also very recent and interesting paper in which they have data for the universe of firms in Ecuador and the universe of bureaucrats and their family members in Ecuador, and kind of do this political connection match, but a much finer level than the previous literature, right? So they find that politically connected firms charge higher prices in procurement, and they have a theoretical model to try to account what are the overall welfare implications of these larger prices that the Ecuadorians pay for procuring their goods. And they assess that the welfare loss is about 0.16% of the budget, which amounts to 92 million US dollars. Honius and Kim have this interesting paper that we will see presenting tomorrow, in which they try to account how much lobbying lowers aggregate productivity in the US, and their numbers account for 11%. So this type of studies in which they use rich administrative data with theory in order to get quantitative analysis of how much this type of political distortions affect the economy, we think that it's also an exciting area of work that is being developed. So in institutional policy reforms here, I'll just be brief. Leonard has mentioned some of these things. We would want in this inception paper to review this literature on policy reforms, legal reforms, administrative and civil society, through the lens of how these policies not only affect economic or political outcomes, but precisely how do they affect the presence of these political distortions and the effect of these political distortions into the economy. So this is an area where we think that we need further literature review, and that this is an area where we might get some potential policy recommendations coming out that might be relevant in some settings. So just to wrap up, let me just go through the key areas where we think that further research is needed. First, we need to figure out what are the relevant political distortions, in what settings, and what are the quantitative effects. Through what mechanism do they affect development? So first we want to understand why are they present in some instances and not others, and why the same political distortions could have maybe positive effects in some settings and not others. What are the mediating factors into why political distortions might be more damaging or not? How do we measure de facto power of elites or special interests? Again, we think that this is key in order to further make progress into this literature. How do we make policy recommendations in the face of these distortions? And how to reform systems characterized by these structural distortions, such as crony capitalism or elite capture. And that's it. So on this, sorry I went a few minutes over time, I'll conclude.